This episode is sponsored by the Global Center for Religious Research, the world's leading academic institute and publisher in atheism and religious trauma.
What is the resurrection hypothesis? Quote from William Lane Craig in his debate with Bart Ehrman. Dr. Ehrman just assumes that the probability of the resurrection on our background knowledge is very low. But here I think he's confused. What, after all, is the resurrection hypothesis? It's the hypothesis that Jesus rose supernaturally from the dead. It is not the hypothesis that Jesus rose naturally from the dead. That Jesus rose naturally from the dead is fantastically improbable. But I see no reason whatsoever to think that it is improbable that God raised Jesus from the dead. In order to show that that hypothesis is improbable, you'd have to show that God's existence is improbable. Well, Dr. Craig, challenge accepted. Because we don't have to show that any God's existence is improbable, just yours, the biblical God. Craig is partially correct. The resurrection per New Testament theology is not a matter of Jesus having naturally arisen from the dead. It is the claim that God raised Jesus from the dead. This God is none other than Yahweh, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, as the New Testament affirms. This presents an insurmountable problem for the resurrection hypothesis. The biblical Yahweh, the only God associated with the resurrection of Jesus, is extraordinarily unlikely to exist. Quote, the biblical God is a character in Hebrew narrative, and therefore is, in a very real sense, a figure of fiction. That's from Robert Carroll, professor of Hebrew Bible and Semitic studies. Someone who knows what he's talking about. The biblical Yahweh appears to be an entirely fictional construct, a Canaanite storm god analogous to Baal, who likewise belonged to a pantheon of mythic deities as the son of the high god El, and likewise battled with mythological creatures like Leviathan and Yam. Yahweh, like Baal, is depicted as a storm deity, has thunder as his voice, hurls the lightning like a spear or shoots it like an arrow, is designated as a rider of the clouds, just like Baal, is depicted as a son of El, especially in Deuteronomy 32, defeated the serpent Leviathan, or the Ugaritan Lotan, and had a conflict with Yam, the sea. This comes from Jaco Garrick's Does Yahweh Exist? A Critique of Realism in Old Testament Theology. I'm only giving you little snippets of his work. You've got to check it out. You can find it on academia.edu. The biblical Yahweh is depicted in explicitly anthropomorphic terms with all the apparent features of primitive human projection. Yahweh has human form. Yahweh looks like an aged man. Yahweh has eyes. Yahweh has ears. Yahweh has a mouth. Yahweh has lips. Yahweh has a tongue. Yahweh has a face. Yahweh has a backside. More than that, Yahweh has a heart. Yahweh has hands and fingers. Yahweh has arms. Yahweh has a nose with which to smell pleasant aromas, the carcasses of burning animals. Yahweh even has feet. Again, you've got to see Jaco Garrick's Does Yahweh Exist? A Critique of Realism in Old Testament Theology. Contra theologians, these are not merely metaphors for a transcendent immaterial being. The notion that the biblical God is pure spirit is something that historically arose from sociocultural pressures and shifts in thought. This is from Francesca Stavrakopoulos' God and Anatomy. The God of modern Abrahamic religion was assembled over the course of 2,000 years from selected scraps of ancient Jewish mysticism, Greek philosophy, Christian doctrine, Protestant iconoclasm, and European colonialism. It was the cultural heft of certain forms of philosophical abstraction that altered the original view of God. The emergence of Greek versions of the Hebrew scriptures in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE had encouraged the gradual and seemingly natural metamorphosis of ancient Levantine mythology into cutting-edge Jewish metaphysics. In a Greco-Roman world in which Judaism and its subsequent Christian inflections were minority religions, some Jewish and Christian intellectuals were keen to demonstrate the erudite, sophisticated truths of their own theologies by identifying the God of their scriptures with constructs of the supreme divine in Greek philosophy. Qualities and attributes of the Jewish and Christian God were instinctively but insistently mapped onto broadly Platonic abstractions. References to God's anatomical features, such as his head, hands, and feet, became increasingly complex metaphors and multi-layered allegories. This is what the Greeks did with many of their gods, with Zeus even, is they got to a point where they said this is too crude and we need to allegorize it. So what happened to the Jewish God Yahweh as well? No, these are not metaphors for something else. They became metaphors for historical reasons. God and anatomy continued. The Christian construct of God as a transcendent, invisible, and incorporeal being is a distorted refraction, not a reflection, of the biblical image of God. The real God of the Bible was an ancient Levantine deity whose footsteps shook the earth, whose voice thundered through the skies. This was also a God who wept and talked and slept and sulked, a God who felt and fought and loved and lost, a God who sometimes failed and sometimes triumphed. This was a God more like the best of us and the worst of us, a God made in our own image. The biblical God was created in our image, not the other way around. He is, as Robert Carroll said, a figure of fiction. I'm not saying I know this about any gods or any kind of vague, ambiguous God concept, but about the biblical Yahweh, yes, I am. Fascinating though his history may be, a fictional character cannot do anything, much less raise someone from the dead. This is akin to saying that Marduk, Zeus, or Papa Smurf raised Jesus from the dead. The resurrection hypothesis fails because it requires the action of a wholly imaginary entity, born out of ancient myth and modified by human abstraction over the centuries. The New Testament makes it abundantly clear that the risen Christ was supposed to return soon to inaugurate the kingdom of God and fulfill messianic prophecy. I've got a whole host of New Testament chapter and verse to see just how imminently this was expected. Nowhere is this more explicit than in Matthew 16:28, where Jesus said to his disciples, "Truly I tell you, some who are standing here will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom." The risen Jesus was supposed to return within the very lifetime of his own disciples. Instead, he remains relegated to an unseen realm, like every other immortalized figure in antiquity. Romulus, Asclepius, Heracles, all the rest. That's how you make the belief unfalsifiable. The argument to the best explanation, involving the least ad hoc assumptions here, is that Jesus is nowhere to be found because he was never actually raised to begin with. And this is unsurprising given that 1, people do not rise from the dead. 2, for someone to be raised from the dead would require a miracle. And 3, the only divine entity ever proposed to perform such a miracle for Jesus, the only supernatural agent that would be motivated or expected to do so, is a fictive construct of hoary tradition and human imagination. If indeed there was a historical Jesus, but no true Yahweh to raise him, then Jesus is dead. I end with a eulogy. This is from Joseph McCabe, his 1926 publication, The Myth of the Resurrection. Historically, there is only the slenderest of evidence of his actual words. It is not likely that anybody kept a record. He had not the slightest idea of founding a new religion, living in history, or influencing all men. He believed that the earth would be destroyed long before they could hear of him in Rome. The Gospels are compilations of Jewish and pagan moral sentiments of the time, harmonizing with the Essenian elements of the ideas of Jesus. Goodbye, pale Galilean. It was not your fault that priests made a normal rule of life of the emergency counsels of austerity which you gave in the belief that the end of the world was nigh. You're not responsible for the Middle Ages. They used you. It seems that according to your poor light, you played a man's part. You denounced priests and priestcraft, and you told men to love one another. You were faithful to the end, by all accounts. You died for what you thought to be truth and the welfare of men. We think differently. Life is good and glorious. Love is the very flower of its sap. But we feel nearer to you than to the priests who affect to speak in your name. Goodbye, dear Galilean.
The Global Center for Religious Research is pulling back the curtain and exposing the harm caused by religious institutions. With a certificate in the philosophy of religion, you'll attend an online lecture series that questions God's existence through reason and argumentation. With a certificate in religious trauma studies, you'll discover the truth from specialists, psychiatrists, and researchers all over the world about how religious doctrine can lead to trauma responses in the body. And right now, Atheologica viewers will get $50 off any certification course just by clicking the link in the description or by going to gcrr.org/courses. Thanks for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe so that you don't miss out on future content. You can also support me on Patreon, where you'll get access to past presentations and an exclusive ebook, including invaluable references and sources. Any help you can provide, no matter how great or small, will go a long way toward keeping this channel going. Big thanks, by the way, to my current patrons. Your encouragement and support mean the world to me.